Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joined us today. My name is Rebecca Wells and I'm the Chief Executive for the Mallee Regional Innovation Centre, and I have the pleasure of being your MC for our webinar panel discussion today. So today we're going to be discussing the opportunity of regional research and innovation in water and agricultural systems. And I'd just like to start off with an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you and from where this presentation is hosted. The lands of the Latchi Latchi, Ningtay, Niri Niri and Wirraga, the first peoples of the Milua Mallee, and pay my respects to their elders and families, past, present and emerging. So today's event is a regular part of the series and we'll be discussing important issues surrounding water security, and we're here to bring together thought leaders from academia, industry, government, and to provide evidence-based insights and to raise the quality of debate around these key issues. The Water, Environment and Agricultural Group at the University of Melbourne work with industry, government and communities to find innovation solutions to tackle water security and environmental challenges. This is the second year of the highly successful Water Security Series. Past events have covered issues including diversification of water supplies, gender equity, impacts of recent bushfires on water resources, precision irrigation, and recent changes in the Victorian rainfall and runoff. So if you'd like to learn more about this program or view any of the early seminars, please visit the website, and I believe those details are there for you. Before we proceed with the panel discussion, the opportunity of regional research and innovation in water and agricultural systems, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for registering for your participation in today's webinar. Please note that this event is being recorded and the video of this webinar will be put on the University's Melbourne School of Engineering's webpage and the EMRIC website in the coming days. As a part of today's discussion, our panel will be answering questions from you. I encourage the audience to engage with the panel through the Q&A box within Zoom. You'll find a Q&A icon. It's on the panel at the bottom of your page, depending on how your screen's set up. To submit your questions, simply open the Q&A chat box and type in your anonymous questions. We will try and get through as many as we can. We often find out we get quite a lot at these sessions. So now, before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Mallee Regional Innovation Centre. The Mallee Regional Innovation Centre is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne, Latrobe University and SuniTafe. The centre has offices in Mildura and we have 4 focal areas we concentrate on. These are energy, water, horticulture and the environment. We opened in May last year and we have started working on a number of projects. These include developing up project teams to look at automating dried vine pruning, looking at technology to make a digital dashboard for horticulture, working with an airborne facility that collects and analyses hyperspectral and thermal imagery and that can look at plant and crop traits like nutrients, water and other stresses. And we've also joined the big team for the One Basin CRC, that's a cooperative research centre, and we're advocating for a Mallee hub as a part of that CRC. And these are some of the things that you're going to hear about today. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the panellists for today's discussion. I'd like to start with Anne Mansell. So Anne Mansell is the Chief Executive Officer for Dried Fruits Australia. Anne has over 30 years experience in horticulture sector and as a partner in a family-owned citrus property, and has served as a board of directors and president of Sunraysia Citrus Growers. Anne is also the inaugural chief executive of the Mildura Development Corporation, and for 5 years oversaw a number of exciting projects such as the OLAM project, which is investment into processing plant, and also the business case for the Sunraysia modernisation project. I'd like to now introduce Davi Ferla. Davi is the Chief Executive Officer for Sensand Technologies, who has over 20 years' experience leading and developing rapid growth enterprises and high-pact consortia. His company is working to drive agriculture and environmental outcomes by solving the technical integration and data management issues that are stifling ag tech adoption. Davi was appointed an Enterprise Fellow of Smart Agriculture by the University of Melbourne in 2019, and he recently assumed the role of Technology Integration Lead for the One Basin CRC bid. I'd now like to introduce you to Dr. Robert Ross. Dr. Robert Ross is a Senior Lecturer in Engineering at Latrobe University. Robert's research is related to robotics, sensors, and mechatronics. His PhD involved autonomous imaging of cars' undercarriages using an imaging system mounted on a mobile robot platform. Robert has also been involved in the development of low-powered embedded systems and sensory packages used for environmental and application-specific monitoring. I'd now like to introduce our fourth and final panellist, Professor Ruth Nettle. So Professor Ruth Nettle is the Rural Innovation Research Group Leader for the School of Agriculture and Food for the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Her research interests are in understanding and improving rural innovation processes with a concern for the significant issues of rural Australia and farming systems, including climate change adaptation and the farm workforce and technology disruption. So with that, I'd just like to thank all our panellists and welcome them to the Water Security Series webinar session today. So to start off, I'll just give you a bit of a context about how this come out today. We know that 2020 has seen collaboration and innovation like no other year in recent times. Industry and researchers are coming together with the goal of solving problems through fit-for-purpose outcomes. But this type of collaboration isn't new, especially in the regions. The panel will discuss regional place-based innovation with a particular focus on the Mallee and Victoria. The Mallee Regional Innovation Centre will feature as an example that is bringing together side-by-side, physically and now virtually, industry, business and researchers with common interests to develop place-based projects that will add value and create impact in the region. Together, they are innovating and creating better projects because they are shaped by those that are here on the ground. And as I mentioned earlier, the centre is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne, Latrobe University and SuniTafe, and the four focal areas we have are water, horticulture, energy and the environment. So what's emerging in 2020 is the discussion on how we capitalise on these opportunities. We've seen so much innovation and collaboration, so it seems appropriate to have a discussion around that. The opportunity for regional research and innovation in water and agricultural systems. Before turning to the panel, I'd encourage you all to please take this opportunity to use the Q&A box and you can start submitting your questions. So with that, I'd like to start off with a question for Ruth. So Ruth, on a global stage, how does Australia fare in terms of innovation through regional research, particularly in agriculture and water, and how much of a factor are place-based activities? I know you've got a lot of experience in this area, and I'm just wondering where you might see that opportunity and value.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rebecca, and it's great to be here today. Yes, it's a really interesting question about regional innovation. We really don't know, I suppose, a lot about how Australia's regional innovation compares, with the rest of the world. And that's, I suppose, we don't really have a strong regional innovation policy. We probably don't measure innovation and innovation performance that well. We still, use some of the metrics around product innovation, like new patents, etc., or publications or time to market, for instance, of new technologies. And that's sort of a bit different from the innovation that, you've just described and what we're talking about today, which is really focusing on, I suppose, new ways of solving problems at a regional scale, thinking about how to generate value to the economy, the community and the environment in this place. So look, broadly, Australia does, really well on the science or the R&D bit of innovation in agriculture and in water. And, as I'm sure this audience knows, our water markets are considered innovative from international standards. But when you, I suppose, look into some of the research around our innovation systems in Australia and our national innovation policy, it comes in for a little bit of criticism. And really that's largely about that we still tend to see innovation as the science, as the R&D policy, where when you look at a lot of countries overseas, and particularly Scandinavia, for instance, R&D and science capacity is seen as a capacity for innovation. It's the fuel, the enzyme, whatever you want to call it. But the innovation policy itself turns its focus more to how that knowledge can be turned into value. And this is where the strong business and community focus and that investment in that translation seems to be more of a priority in many other countries. Australia, I suppose, also has what we call, I suppose, a very sectoral focus in its innovation. Some people would call it siloed. We look at the manufacturing sector, we look at the energy sector, we look at the food and agriculture sector sort of separately when we come to innovation. So although there has been a shift to more place-based thinking, it's not, I suppose, advanced as much as what we might like. So I suppose when we think about regional innovation systems, which is a great conversation to be having today, I suppose what I'd suggest, we do need to recognise it is a different way of doing things, and the funding mechanisms aren't necessarily geared to that here in Australia. So the principles that you've just described in Emmerich, that it's business and industry, government and research and education working together. You've got a big sort of business or problem-driven, that's what's leading the innovation. It's cross-sectoral, so you're thinking about water, energy, agriculture. That's what's creating some of the critical mass that, you can't necessarily get by looking at one thing alone. And, I'm sure we're going to hear today about this experimentation, the continual learning that's bringing a lot of dynamism and agility. So I suppose really in summary to your question that, we don't really focus a lot on regional innovation policy in Australia. I think it's a really good discussion to be having today because what I'm sure we're going to hear is the energy and enthusiasm of the local people and businesses, has to be sustained. We can get some quick wins, but it can be vulnerable. So also in the food and fibre sector, agriculture, there's a large population of SMEs. So you have to have that capacity to co-invest locally over time. So, that's a bit of a summary of where I see that the whole issue of regional innovation. And I'm just really looking forward to the discussion today, Rebecca.
Great. Thanks for that, Ruth. I think that gives a really nice setting to move forward on the conversation. I think naturally leads me to put a question to Anne next. And Anne, as a follow-up to that, and I guess putting maybe the Mallee in some context, just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about your experience and your knowledge of the Mallee and innovation in the region. We know there's a history of that. Just wondering if you could maybe talk about that and what it looks like now as well.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining today. I guess Mildura in itself started off as a vast experiment and a very innovative experiment back in sort of 1886. And without the water that was available through the Murray River, we wouldn't be here today all these years later. And it was simply because there was water and there was an opportunity that was seen in terms of utilising that for irrigated horticulture. So we have up here, I think, a cultural heritage of innovation and of people actually trying to make things happen for themselves because really we were so isolated from a lot of other agencies and a lot of other government entities. So Mildura started off with that sort of experimental look at how irrigated horticulture could be done, certainly in the colony of Victoria at that stage. And it was interesting to read just briefly today that 100 years ago today, Francois de Castella visited Recluse, which was a soldier settlement area being developed. And he came to inspect the vines because obviously he was someone who'd done a lot of work in cultivating rootstocks so that they're resistant to phylloxera. So we were bringing in people all the time from that, sort of 1886 development right through to today in terms of helping us with innovation. And helping us with research and development. So the dried fruits industry once again came about because of an innovation. There was difficulty in selling the fresh fruit that had been developed originally because of lack of transportation, rivers running dry, no rail. So the dried product then became more advantageous. And then, of course, I had to look at, well, what were the suitable conditions and what was going to make the dried grape industry here more sustainable long-term and more profitable. So over the years, there's been a lot of work and funding put into that. Even as early as 1919, research and development levies were, if you like, imposed on, they were voluntary at that stage, but basically the packers of dried fruit took that out of the returns going back to the growers. And that was used to set up the first Merbein site, if you like, which eventually developed into the CSIRO site that we had here for about 90 years. So that whole issue about looking at what we can do to improve was facilitated by local people wanting to see a better advantage for their product going forward and making it more profitable longer term. I think another one of the great examples we've had here, and it's led into, I think, what we now have with Emmerich, but was the Riverlink project, which was developed back in the 1990s. And Riverlink brought together the CSIRO, brought AgVic, the Department of Primary Industry in New South Wales, and SARDI and PERSOL, which are the Department of Ag in South Australia. So all of those are working together with producers and with industry stakeholders. And basically, every year there'd be an annual meeting of looking at projects that could be done in terms of not just industry by industry, but across industries as well. And a lot of really good research and innovative work came out of that time frame. I think it went to about 2008. So we had, sort of 10 years of this sort of collaborative approach. And to me, that's been the most important thing that we've learnt over our 100 or so years of history in our industry of dried grapes, but across all our horticultural industries in this area, is that collaboration, working together with our stakeholders, working with researchers, and then trying to work out what is the best way forward. That's how we've ended up with more efficient irrigation practices, drip irrigation and so forth. That's how we've ended up with, in our industry, more productive vines, looking at our rootstock development, looking at our new varieties to be more climate tolerant. That's the sort of work that we have done, both within our industry but across industries, to really benefit our region and our producers going forward. So I think, we've had some other examples as well, obviously, that we can talk about, but I think what we've had is that local approach to wanting to see innovation and development, which also then led to Emmerich, working with both the University of Melbourne, Latrobe and SuniTafe in what we can now do going forward over the next 10, 15, 20 years in, once again, bringing good innovation to our region, to our place here in the sort of wider Sunraysia district.
Thanks, Anne. That's great to get that history of how there's that, I guess, culture, as you described it, of innovation here in the region. And I think, we're going to hear a little bit more today about how that's been built on. So thank you for that. I guess naturally now I would like to turn to Robert for a question, and I guess this has the link to Dried Fruits Australia. We know that you're working on a project with them and looking at the automation of pruning of dried fruit vines. And just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also that connection to the people on the ground, and how that connection, what sort of influence or impact that have on your work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca, for the question. So it's been a really fascinating project that's really getting underway at the moment. There was this time-consuming factor that was found of doing the winter pruning. So after harvest time, you've got a whole lot of little bits of vine sticking out of the cordon, and you need to prune them. And the current process is having people on moving platforms that drive along at 1 kilometre an hour or half a kilometre an hour or something with electric secateurs and just manually clipping them all off as they go along. And so that was the key problem. How can we make this more efficient and scalable? You've got labour problems and things like that. And how can we actually allow farmers to expand what they're able to do, expand the size of their farms and things in a scalable sort of manner? So we've been looking at a mechanisation approach, designing essentially a device that we're making it tractor mounted, and some intelligent systems using machine vision and things like that to allow us to basically go along and cut off all of those all of the parts of the vine that were sticking out, and doing it very, very quickly, and doing multiple runs at the same time. So on one side of the tractor and on the other side of the tractor. So you've got some speed ups that are happening there in terms of the process. in terms of the interactions on the ground and working with people, it's been a real pleasure. Before this project, my expertise in dried fruit was mainly eating it. My background's in engineering, in robotics and electronics, and so actually talking to the farmers and people like at Trig Industries who've been developing a whole lot of hardware that's used within the dried fruit on many different farms across the region. And of course, DFA, who have taken me out to farms, and we've had many long meetings and discussions and refining designs and things. One of the things we've found in our field trials is being able to take hardware out onto the farms and put it in the hands of the farmers and say, well, what do you think? And they've, on multiple occasions, we've gone and said, oh, well, maybe we could improve this process and maybe we could improve this process. And at the end of the day, they're the end users and the ones that need to be happy with it. So getting that feedback directly in and seeing how sometimes there's some contextual things you don't realise, that it's not until you're out on the farm and actually doing it on the farm that you realise, hang on a sec, that's not going to work, or here's a better solution that actually solves an extra problem that we didn't know beforehand. So we're keen to get more feedback from the growers as we develop this tool more and more, and make it something that will suit more and more growers across the region.
Great. Thanks, Robert. That's a really good description. And I think, I've been able to see a few of those gatherings with the growers and, some of the things that have come for that, and the way that the growers have gone away and thought about it and fed back to you has been really great, just in terms of that fit for purpose and how it further develops what you're working on. So thanks for sharing that with us. I think next I just want to turn to Davi, because you've also got some work that's connected here to the region, but I know you work across Australia. But the work that you're doing here in the Mallee at the moment, just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that and how you made the connections, and where do you see the opportunities for research and innovation in the regions?
Thanks, Rebecca. Just by way of background, Sensand is a tech company, and it works at the nexus of agriculture and the environment. So it's an ag tech and envirotech company. And we're all very familiar with the impacts of flood events, drought events, bushfire events, zoonotic disease events, inclusive of COVID-19. And there's a heightened interest in terms of the role that tech can play in terms of assisting farmers and natural resource managers to anticipate and respond to various shifts. And so Sensand's about integrating technologies and managing the data for the benefit of users. So we're working, as you're right, across Australia. For example, we're working across a massive cattle station that's about 400,000 hectares, or about 1 million acres, where we're principally looking to anticipate, detect and control weeds on that property, given the massive impact that weeds have on agricultural practices and properties, and also natural resource management. There is another project where we're working with Latrobe University, a partner of Emmerich, looking at the design and deployment of natural capital accounting, so natural capital tools that will assist primary producers to take account of and get rewarded for environmental stewardship. So we're working across 50 properties in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania to really embed those tools down. And that really brings those properties and others across ag and natural resource management into the frame of thinking about the nexus between water, between carbon and energy and other aspects, so that there's a far more holistic view of what's possible across those properties. As you've referenced, I'm proudly working with Mike and you and others in the One Basin CRC bid, up and down the entire Murray-Darling Basin. So we're looking at the Northern Hub, the Mid-Basin Hub, the Lower Hub, the Goulburn and Central Murray Hub, and obviously the Mallee Hub. And that's really around looking at the ways in which regional communities could shape the agenda over the short-term, mid-term and long-term across various themes. And tech is playing a key role there. Bringing it closer to home, Sensand's working at SuniTafe at the property to create a digital representation of that farm. So we're thinking very carefully about the role of technology, existing technologies at the farm, but setting the property up for a future portfolio of properties that can assist the current manager and all of the staff and the teaching staff and the students to better understand the role of tech at that farm, but more importantly, connect that farm to other commercial properties in the region across the Sunraysia. And that provides that digital link, but very importantly, the people link, the human-to-human links. So technology has a role there, particularly when it's around the integration. And so together we're really reimagining and reinvigorating the regions. It's about being, as Ruth has spoken about, it's about being tech-enabled but human-centred, being really centred on people and the way that people use tech. And that's where the innovation comes from. And Robert touched on part of that before, where interactions with people make a big difference in terms of how we understand tech and the role that tech can play. And I can see, based on the work that Robert's doing, that you can migrate into end-to-end sensing and automation of systems that can pay handsome dividends to what's happening on the ground.
Great. Thanks for that, Davi. That's really good. Such a wealth of information there in terms of some of the things that you're engaging in. And I think that future looking forward for, the industry and agriculture and water, all these sorts of things are going to be so vital. Knowing that, there is a wealth of information, but how is that put together and used in the best way possible? So thanks for that. Just looking at the Q&A, just if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to put them on. You may have some questions for any of the panellists. It may be around, some challenges that you've got and you want to ask them about, or questions that relate to what we've spoken about. So please don't hesitate to go to the Q&A box down the bottom of your screen and put in your questions. So while we're moving along, I might just go back to Ruth then. So I know you've done a lot of work in the regions, Ruth, and you may want to talk a little bit about that. But co-innovation is something that we see coming up as a term now. I'm just wondering if you're seeing that, but also too maybe what your definition of co-innovation is as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rebecca. We always like to come up with complex terms for simple ideas, don't we? But I think Anne and Rob and Davi, I suppose, have basically described co-innovation in practice. It's basically people and organisations working together to innovate. Now, that doesn't sound that startling, but I think it is important to remember that it's still quite common to think of innovation as a pipeline from, pure science, if you will, or, being transferred to an applied scientist, someone like Robert, who's, working on how that might be able to be applied, and experimenting with applications and coming out with some product that's then purchased or adopted by somebody. Now, this is still a very prevalent model, I suppose, of innovation, and for product innovation within a company sense, it's got to be quite efficient, and in the past this was seen as the way that any business could get their competitive advantage. If you had the best ideas and the best people than your competition, then, this is how you got ahead. I suppose nowadays, and what we've just heard from the past, is that, really agriculture, and particularly these water contexts as well, have probably always seen innovation as an ecosystem, that it's actually the best ideas and the best people, no matter what company or organisation you represent, whether you're in research, whether you're a farmer, that you actually need to be working together. And so I think actually what we've just described is that something's been lost across our regions and in Australia overall, about that we've always known, especially in agriculture. I'm really talking from that context because that's sort of the context I work in, that we've always known that this is the way innovation happens, but it's become harder, or more difficult to have that. And I suppose I really was interested when Anne talked about, this was all happening, this history of innovation was all happening till about 2008. And, that was the year that Australia's innovation policy came into, focus. There was a big report done, and in agriculture there were some key decisions made about creating critical mass or central places for research. And this is partly, we know that R&D expenditure has been going down as a proportion of our GDP. There's a lot of perhaps private sector money, but in terms of government investment, that's been falling. And so rightly, people are focusing on how do we get critical mass? How do we get, supposedly bigger bang for the buck? But I think for particularly a lot in agriculture, that had a lot of unintended consequences, some of those policy moves. And it really meant that the capacity to foster the regional innovation declined for some regions. And so it's created this need to have these place-based innovations. But that doesn't mean we have to go back to the past. It's about what's the modern way that we can really generate this given the constraints that we face. So I think, from my experience, I work around new technologies. So we're involved with virtual herding technology around different parts of Australia, looking at the social science aspects of that. We've looked at community resilience and drought resilience with communities in Western New South Wales and Queensland. We work in a lot of different areas as social researchers. And I suppose what we learn or what we see is that drive to adapt and trial and experiment amongst farmers and communities to create that environment that can attract dollars and attract people and bring in expertise. So that outward-looking nature of regions. And so, look, there's no, I suppose, quick answer, but I suppose these partnerships with the research and development capacity across universities like Emmerich, across the vocational education, bringing in the passion of the local people and bringing in that expertise in sort of new ways. We have to foster that more. So we really need to also focus on the translation and adaptation side, and what Robert just described there about that iterations that need to go on, really has to happen in place. So I suppose there's some of the things that I suppose we know some of the principles, Rebecca, but it's very hard. But I think it's important to see that there's a need perhaps to revitalise this possibility in agriculture and water across the country.
Thanks, Ruth. We have had a question come in. I think you've partly answered it, but I'll read it out. You may have something further to add. So the question was, in the context of research, what is the bottleneck you consider needs more input to improve the existing systems? So did you have anything further you want to add? I know you've actually talked a lot to that question just then.
Look, this is going to sound so pithy, but everybody says, you've got to get the end users, inverted commas, involved right at the start. And yet we still see so often that doesn't happen in the start of research, in priority setting, but then not to leave it there, to continue that engagement all the way through at different times and places, because we know that we know that people are short of time and they want to be working on the most important thing and contribute where they're needed at the right time. And so this is where having facilitation of the process and expertise around this is really important, because from a social researcher perspective, part of that job is to identify when is it most important to get farmers involved, for instance, and at what point, and then when do we need the advisors involved, and to really help and smooth that process. So I think there are lots of spots or positions where we still aren't getting that right, where we're talking to people about their priorities and then not involving them when there's some designs on the table. So we still keep coming up with something polished and then say, well, why aren't people taking things up? So I think there's a couple of insights there anyway about still we need to do better and do more of it.
Thanks, Ruth. We have got some questions coming in, but I'm actually just going to go to Anne for a question, just because it leads on from exactly what you were talking about. And I guess, it's almost the flip side of this, being in the regions and how you, effectively communicate with researchers and engage with them. So just, Anne, just wondering if you've got any commentary around that. What is an effective researcher, and when does it lead to innovation? And within that process too, where does the industry adoption and ownership come into it?
Yeah, it's an interesting example if we look at what we did with the winter pruning project that Robert was talking about before. And this has been quite a process which I think this industry, the dried fruit industry, has engaged in over many, many, many years. So if we look at, if I just put the winter pruning project to one side for a moment and go back to the trellis drying, which sort of started way back in the 1970s and took, a period of probably 20 years or so to really develop, but it was industry working with researchers in getting that right. So it took time, but it was some really go-ahead people within the industry that could see labour costs were spiralling out of control, and they needed to have some form of mechanisation to change that and to make the industry sustainable and profitable for the long term. And it was some of those growers actually working alongside of researchers that came up with the mechanisms for a swing arm trellis and a mechanised process for harvesting. And similarly with what we've done with the winter pruning project, we started that, it's been on the table for quite a few years, but we actually had a roundtable discussion back in 2018. So we facilitated that with our industry producers, our people that process the fruit, and our researchers that we knew of that were, sort of half involved in mechanisation from various places. And we had a really good roundtable about what were the different scenarios that we needed to look at, where did we need to get to with that particular project, and how could we get there. Luckily, at the same time as we were going through that process, MRIC was starting to develop up here in Mildura locally, and we knew we had some people we could tap into. So we put that as one of the first projects to MRIC to say, are there any researchers that you're aware of that might be able to, help facilitate this particular project? We're also very fortunate that we had a little bit of funding and we had some committed producers and some branches of our industry organisation that were committed in seeing this project come to fruition and committed quite a bit of funding to it as well. And then obviously Latrobe and also could tap into some funding. But that is a real, it takes quite a bit of time and quite a bit of collaboration to get all that joining together and making sure that now we're starting to see the experimental side of that process with Robert's assistance moving forward. We've also got some growers that are, also trialling a few things as well, and then we're bringing those together. So the beauty of the industry association, as you like, is being able to bring all those players together, link them all up and get an end result, which we hope will, over time, benefit our industry and make it efficient, make it productive, and then lead to further profitability. If we want industry uptake, they're the key things I believe that we need to look at: efficiency, productivity, and at the end of the day, profitability. And then obviously industry adoption is when we start then, really preaching the message, if you like, to right across our industry stakeholders and saying this will benefit you in the shorter term, medium term and longer term. So let's see if we can get some more uptake in that mechanised area. And we've got quite a bit of push from our board as well, saying this is the priority. So that's why we're working on it. I guess I would like to just touch on funding for a moment, because I think that's another big issue and a big challenge for all of us, particularly in horticulture. Is trying to find matching funding for research and development and then actually making it happen on the ground. It is very difficult at times to actually be able to either attract new funding or look at our own R&D levies and see where we can utilise those. We only have a certain amount of that, and we really have to highly prioritise where that R&D funding can go to. And that's been used, considerably over many years for a whole range of things which has benefited our industry, as I said before, like rootstocks and vine development, the mechanised trellis or mechanisation of harvest with the trellis systems, and now we're looking at this. But it's a continual challenge for us in terms of being able to source funding to get that innovation happening in a place-based area or in one industry sector. So I hope that sort of gives a bit of an answer to that question, Rebecca.
Thanks, Anne. That's great. I guess it's that thing. There's so many different elements to this when you start to talk about it that all factor in to make something successful. I think, this leads really nicely to a question that we've come from the audience today. So any of you may want to take the opportunity to answer this one. So the question is, there are often lots of synergies between water, energy and the environment, but do you see technology helping to solve areas where there are trade-offs, e.g. water, improved water use for efficiency, energy efficiency, that sort of thing? Did anyone want to take a go at answering that?
So, Rebecca, I think that's a great question. Absolutely. There are developments in each of those areas. Technologies associated with water, technologies with energy, technologies for carbon. There's a whole range, a portfolio of technologies. The key here is about acknowledging that there may be some trade-offs, but in many cases, one needs to ask the question about, well, does there need to be a trade-off? Can you, in fact, advance multiple interests by looking at integrations that serve multiple interests? Because the default case of it's an either-or, it's a zero-sum game, doesn't necessarily hold true. It can be a positive-sum game. So the team at the One Basin CRC bid is acknowledging that there is, for example, the nexus between energy and water, where land use managers, so primary producers, farmers and natural resource managers, are thinking through the options in terms of benefiting from the way in which they manage water and energy through the use of smart tech that enables them to advance on the two. Clearly, there will be trade-offs in many circumstances, but that isn't necessarily the default if one can think, as Ruth was pointing to before, about the innovations that are possible. And to that extent, we're really talking about the spectrum between incremental innovation, so things that we will do progressively, versus transformational innovation, the things that will be outside the box. So that outside the box thinking will largely enable us to be thinking about and addressing options for primary producers that they can benefit not at the expense of doing something else. That's part of the answer, Rebecca.
Great. Did anyone else want to add to that? No? All right. Might move along. We've got a few questions coming in through the Q&A. So please, yes, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and put in your questions. So I've got a question about do you think government and organisations and management have become more risk adverse to innovation and experimentation, given that social media and traditional media are so happy to highlight less than perfect results? So did anyone want to have a go at answering that question?
Rebecca, I could start. Not that I'm any, great expert on this, but I'd generally just say yes. But I suppose partly the risk aversion has been learned, not just from the social media aspect, but I suppose we can all think of the big investment in what might have been thought as the silver bullet or the best hope, and seeing sort of lots of unintended consequences or sort of solutions not necessarily falling out as what might have been expected. So I think this is part of the co-innovation story, though, that it is about sharing risk and scaling opportunities. So I think the coming together to share risk and pilot, experiment at a good scale, but then commit to the scaling up are some ways, I suppose, to manage risk. But I agree it's part of the problem. And this is where I suppose MRIC, you've been built off business leaders that have co-invested in their future with government and universities, and that's sharing risk. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that, Ruth. We've got a few more questions, so I might just move on to some more of those that have come in. Davi, this one's actually for you that's come in. A big problem we find sometimes in the disconnection between industry offering services in regional areas and the innovation methods and technology coming out from university research. How do you see this problem, and how can we ensure that the university and industry work together to make sure farmers get the latest available?
Great question, and thank you for asking it. The future for us isn't about regional, remote, rural communities being simply passive consumers of tech. I think we will miss a massive opportunity if we take that approach from the get-go. We need those communities to participate not just in the consumption of or adoption of that tech, but in shaping the way that we're thinking about tech, designing the tech, building the tech, integrating the tech, and servicing the tech for the long term. So this is one of the disconnects that we've pointed to, and one of the very key things that I think we can make massive leaps forward in terms of shaping the way that tech is conceived of and ultimately serving a purpose. And I think the really smart institutions are recognising that in terms of the research that's being done and the importance of impact, that impact is shaped by relationships with regional communities, not transactions, relationships with regional communities that allow those regional communities to participate fully. And so we can have conversations with various growth centres like Food Innovation Australia Limited, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and think through what that actually means. What does it mean to take that approach where you're engaging people in the process? And what we fully expect to happen is if we take that path, and we are taking that path, we will see the creation of enterprises within the regions. And those regions aren't simply consuming, but they're creating. And in fact, they're not creating just for their communities, but they're creating for other communities, and not just in their neighbourhoods. They're creating for communities around the state, around the country, and in fact, pursuing export markets. That's what we should be really doing, and that's in fact baked into the approaches that we're taking across multiple fronts, within the One Basin CRC bid, at MRIC, and also within Sensand Technologies, and it's not limited to those institutions. So that's really the approach that is being taken right now, and it underpins the comments that Anne had made and Ruth had made about the importance of engaging with those communities and being innovative, both incremental and transformative.
Thanks, Davi. I think that actually naturally leads me to ask a question to Robert. Knowing the area that you're working in with robotics and the different types of technologies now, so whether it's artificial intelligence or virtual tools that are being more widely recognised, we know there's a lot of discussion whether it's about labour or some of the things that Davi's just mentioned. I'm just wondering how you see those opportunities for that research and development in the regions, and is there a way to fast track some of this now?
Thanks, Rebecca. I think there is, and it's a huge problem. Before COVID came along and getting people from overseas working on farms and things, it was a problem getting labour. I imagine that's very much exacerbated at the moment due to the fact that I can't even get to Mildura at the moment, let alone someone from wherever they might be. I think there's some tasks across the industry that require significant labour, and talking to people like this one we've talked about the winter prunings one, but there's others in parallel industries. For example, the process of covering up grapevines for table grapes currently requires upwards of 9 people to do that. And so it's a very labour-intensive process, and something lots of people all want to do at the same time because they all want to cover their grapes at the right time of season. So there's incremental spikes in this labour. So I think there's lots of solutions around the AI, virtual tools tech that can be applied, not necessarily to avoid all labour altogether, but to give you incremental improvements in that. So if you can get one person doing a job, or if you can reduce a job from 9 people down to 4 people, and they're doing a slightly different job as a result, well, that's an improvement there in terms of how farmers are able to manage their properties and manage those labour shortages which happen, which go up and down at various times. But it comes of thinking about the problem a bit differently sometimes. Sometimes I use the example of if you wanted to make a robot to wash your dishes, people might start off with thinking, oh, we'll have a robot with 2 arms and it's got a scrubbing brush and it washes the dishes and puts them to one side after they've been rinsed. But of course, most of us have a robot that washes our dishes in our house, and it looks nothing like that. It's a dishwasher. And so sometimes it's looking at that process in a completely different light of, oh, well, this is how we're currently doing it. Like we've got someone going along with secateurs, cutting off all these little parts off the cordon. Well, what's the robotic way? What's the automation way that we could best capture that process and have a similar sort of outcome? And it will mean probably less labour is required, and those labourers doing a slightly different job as a result.
Great, thank you. I know lots of exciting stuff, I think, going on in that area at the moment, and really keen to see, at what points that'll have an impact of some of the operations that we have here in the region. And a great explanation about the dishwasher too. I really like that. Thank you. I think I might just we've got another question that's come in, and I think I'll actually direct this one to Ruth. It's quite a long question, so I'm going to make an attempt at summarising it. So it is actually about authorities and landowners and collaboration. And I guess what it's the question, the theme of the question is that genuine sense of collaboration, that sometimes it can be poor, sometimes things are done through a process and it's a bit of a tick and flick process. And, there can be other ways of doing things. So I might hand that over to you, Ruth. I know you've had a chance to look at that as well. So maybe you can have a go at answering that.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Points back to our discussion about, I suppose, collaboration or co-innovation that we spoke of. That there's been, I suppose, a familiarity, I suppose, especially with the water processes of community engagement and involvement. But I suppose there's always, I suppose, a slippage back, I think, often to consultation and consultation only. So I think it is really an important issue for greater bringing together of local knowledge, in combination with the problem or what's really trying to be improved here, and where is value. There could be multiple forms of value from change. It's a bit like what Robert was talking about there, that we can think one way that what a solution is for, but there actually might be, and what Davi talked about as well, this stacking of benefits, and you can get more than the 1 + 1 equals 2. So even, for instance, in the workforce example that we've been looking at the role of technology in workforce replacement, but quite often it's not replacing workforce. It's actually allowing growth or different development. So it's the same around if we're really committed to collaboration and partnership and a shared vision for what's trying to be achieved, which I think is what Anne has described, is the process that's underway in Emmerich and has gone on in the past. If we're truly committed to that vision, even though we've got parallel purposes, then we have to have different processes of engagement and collaboration that means we don't slip back to consultation. Now that's hard. We've been involved with projects in climate adaptation, and there's a lot of I suppose creative conflict around modelling and between scientists and farmers around climate modelling. But if we just say, oh, that's all right, the scientists will go off on their pathway and the farmers will go off on their pathway and let's just call it irreconcilable, is not the path of innovation. It's really working hard together on the shared solutions. So, look, I know that might sound a bit motherhood there, Rebecca, but I think the question is correct. We're still not drawing on local knowledge enough. We're still not have the processes that involve people in developing that shared solution to issues. And I think water is one of those spaces. I think ag tech and digital agriculture is another, and we've got to get better at that. I think, some of the ideas in the One Basin CRC, do try to lock that in as a way of governing. So, but it's a very good question. I think we do need to do better.
Thanks, Ruth. Well, I've just looked at the time. We run out of time, so I thanks very much for that. It's great to have those questions answered. I know there was also another comment about a picture of the pruning, Robert's pruning machine, but that's still actually in the design phase at the moment, so we haven't got that presently. So I guess with all of that, time's gone really quickly. Thanks so much, everyone. So on behalf of the Water, Environment, Agriculture Program and the University of Melbourne, I'd just like to thank the panel for your contribution to the opportunity of regional research and innovation in water and agricultural systems discussion. So thanks, Anne, Robert, Davi and Ruth. That was really good. I know there's more questions we could be asking you, but we'll have to call it a close. I'd also like to thank the audience for your questions today and your interest. We always really value those. And just also to let you know that the next 2020 Water Security Series event will take place on Wednesday, the 18th of November. An industry panellist will discuss how is the Basin Plan restoring environmental flow regime in the Murray-Darling. So to register for that, you'll be able to go to the website, and I believe those details are there for you. And finally, just thank you everyone for attending today, and we really appreciate your input on the post-event survey, which will appear on your screen after this session. So we really value that feedback. It helps us shape our future events. And with that, thanks everyone, and see you next time.